Well, thank you for having me. I didn't know if you would see me today, and not just because of the tornadoes that came through Dallas last night and nearly caused our plane not to leave, but I have to say that I was appalled last night by Stan Evans traducing the name of that great Texan Anna Nicole Smith. It was just so sad to me to see her spoken of that way, and I look forward to the day when we can erect a statue in downtown Dallas, indeed on Dealey Plaza, to her greatness, because she is a true Texan. But I recovered, Stan, and so here I am. The whole crunchy conservatism thing was a complete accident. I was between moving to Dallas and my gig at the New York Post, I spent a year at National Review. One summer there, my first summer of 2002, I was leaving the office to go back to Brooklyn, where my wife and I lived, a little early, and I told Catherine Lopez, my boss, I said, I got to get out of here a little bit early today to go pick up the shipment of organic vegetables from our community-supported agriculture co-op. And she looked at me and said, organic vegetables? That's so lefty. And I thought on the way out, well, you know, she might have a point there. I'd always thought of organic vegetables as lefty, but in fact, Julie and I had started subscribing to the co-op after a friend let us have her shipment one week, and they were absolutely delicious, and they were costing no more than what we'd pay at the New York City supermarkets for vegetables. Plus, we liked the idea of our food dollar going directly to help farmers in our region. But on the way home, I was thinking about that, and on the subway, I looked down at my feet, and there I was wearing a pair of Birkenstock sandals. And I thought, now, that's lefty. But I thought about how I had come to wear Birkenstock sandals. Julie and I had just moved to New York in 1998 after we got married, and my feet were killing me trying to get used to walking everywhere. She said, you ought to try a pair of Birkenstocks. And I looked at her and said, in effect, ew, that's so lefty. But she said, don't be silly. Try these sandals on. So I tried them on, and they were the most comfortable shoes I'd ever had. And I bought them, and just finally this year wore them out. Like 8 or 9 years later, they lasted that long. But it made me reflect on how my silly sort of my conservative prejudice against Birkenstocks, the liberal shoes, had kept me from trying something that was really good for me and really didn't have anything to do with politics at all. So I ended up coming back to the office the next day and writing a little piece for National Review Online about granola conservatism, and talked about the ways that my wife and I, because we were traditionalists or coming to be traditionalists by following our Catholic faith, and how we found that being faithful Catholics within the conservative political tradition was putting us sort of off the reservation with a lot of mainstream conservatives. I put that on NRO and forgot about it. Well, I kid you not, I got over 500 emails from conservatives around the country saying, me too. And we had this big debate on the corner about crunchy conservatism, which is how it came to be labeled, with sort of a joke on crunchy granola. And to make a very long story short, I ended up writing a book about this whole thing, defining the phenomenon, and talking to actual crunchy conservatives all around the country, Protestants, Catholics, Orthodox, even interviewed a Jewish person for the book who talked about being a crunchy conservative within the context of her religious faith. Bruce Fronin, a friend of mine, a friend to a lot of people here, has called crunchy conservatism, quote, traditional conservatism with just enough of a funky twist to get a hearing in the mass markets. I think he's right about that, because otherwise the New York Times would not have reviewed the book, though they didn't know what to make of it. The reviewer, David Kirkpatrick, who used to cover the conservative movement for the Times when they actually had that as a beat, he seemed to like the book, though he treated its vision more as a curious artifact. Nor would the Washington Post have given the book a style section cover feature if not for that sort of trendy lifestyle gloss that I put on traditional conservatism. The reporter, it was an openly gay liberal who had asked my publicist in all seriousness before he came down if the Drehers, being right-wing troglodytes, would be comfortable with a homosexual crossing the threshold of their house. I ended up calling the guy up to assure him, no, that's okay, everything is fine. And I said, but you have to do one thing. After dinner, you have to stand in front of the hearth and give us a dramatic recitation of the gay agenda. And he laughed at that, and everything was fine. We had a great time. And he turned out to be a perfectly nice guy, but he didn't really care about the core traditionalist vision. He just thought it was an interesting lifestyle choice, which speaks, I think, to the problem with calling this thing crunchy conservatism. It made it harder for some to take my claims seriously. Giving it that colorful label made it interesting in a way, but it also tended to trivialize it and really to make it come across as just another lifestyle option, a path to enlightenment for right-wing bobos. This is unfortunate because crunchy conservatism is, at bottom, in its essence, a case made for a popular audience for re-examining and embracing a traditionalist conservative sensibility, one that has been pushed to the margins of American conservative life. It's one that I only started to become fully aware of after the trauma of 9/11, which had a similar effect on me as the gathering of the Nazi storm in T.S. Eliot's account had on Britons in 1938. It made me wonder, as a conservative and as a Christian, if there was more to our civilization than wandering aimlessly in search of prosperity. What I'm really getting at in the book, Crunchy Cons, is not meditations on the superiority of organic vegetables or styles of housing, but rather fundamental cultural, moral, and metaphysical concerns about the way we live today. In his introduction to Pope Benedict's wonderful 2006 book, Without Roots, George Weigel writes, "What drives history? Politics? Economics? Some combination of politics and economics? Or should we look elsewhere to find the engine of history? To the realm of the human spirit, perhaps? Might it be that culture, what men and women honor, cherish, and worship, is the most dynamic element in human affairs, at least over the long haul?" Close quote. That's it exactly. Crunchy Cons is meant to be a book about culture and how our most basic ideas about what people are for dictate the way we choose to live in a number of areas. I wrote a book of journalism with Crunchy Cons, not political theory. By design, I wanted it to be accessible. I wanted it not just to say, this is how you should live, but to show actual conservatives living out these principles and doing so joyfully. I was so pleased when I read that Washington Post style section cover story, knowing how hostile in principle the journalist was. I was so pleased when the story came out and his final line there was, so driving away from dinner at the Drehers, I thought, wow, those people sure are happy. I thought, that's it. That defeats the stereotype right there that so many on the left have, that to be a conservative is to be so sour-faced. I wanted to help readers, make it easier for readers to imagine themselves doing the same thing, living differently, living counterculturally as conservatives. My editor at Crown Forum, who was a dyed-in-the-wool, organic, crunchy leftist, rejected an early draft I sent her of a chapter on the intellectual roots of traditionalist conservatism. She said that was too abstract, that the book should appeal to a broad mainstream audience, and the best way to do this was to keep the philosophizing to a minimum and rather to show people incarnating those principles into their lives. Now, that kind of wounded my intellectual pride. I was a bit put off by this. But every time I get an email, and I get them every week, for people like an ordinary homeschooling mom somewhere who writes to say that Crunchy Cons made her understand things about life and politics and these hidden connections between things and conservatism that she never quite thought of, I see the wisdom of my editor's charge. Good people who don't read political books are finding their way to traditionalism through this slight little work of journalism. The thing is, I didn't want this book to be grim and heavy because that's not how I am, and that's not the spirit in which I live out my convictions. The people I know who call themselves Crunchy Cons or identify with the label are among the most joyful and confident people you will ever meet. It was my hope that Crunchy Cons would provide a genial entry point into a broader discussion that transcends the usual left-right labels about the way we live today and how the way we live today reflects the deeper convictions we have. In particular, I wanted to write about how we conservatives can and should change our lives so that we can better honor the things we say we believe in. To the extent that the way I wrote the book leads people to think I'm just trying to baptize organic broccoli as conservative and, baptize Birkenstocks as right-wing, well, I regret that. But then again, I'm convinced that at least some of my critics on the right, and I'm thinking of my chief antagonist, Jonah Goldberg at National Review, insist on reading the book this way to avoid having to confront some of the central questions that Crunchy Cons raises. Now, I'd love to stand before you at a Russell Kirk conference and report that I arrived at my traditionalist convictions through scholarly study and intellectual deliberation. Didn't happen. I am, alas, a journalist. And as a product of one of the bigger state universities, not a very well-read one at that. We were just talking at the table about how, having gone to LSU, I think the classwork was ancillary to the drinking. And I'm not apologizing for that. I arrived at my traditionalist convictions through observation, by temperament, shaped no doubt by my Southern upbringing, and by the act of trying to integrate the sacramental Catholic Christian worldview into every aspect of my life, especially as a husband and a father. I didn't encounter Russell Kirk's work until later, and I still consider myself a neophyte student of Dr. Kirk's. But in his writing and in his vision, I find the highest fulfillment of what it means to be a conservative. I describe him in the book as the patron saint of crunchy conservatism, though I'm reasonably certain, Annette can correct me if I'm wrong, I'm reasonably certain that Russell Amos Kirk never put on a pair of Birkenstock sandals. But I've called him the patron saint and consider him the patron saint because everything I've ever written about this neo-traditionalist sensibility is really just a set of minor footnotes to Dr. Kirk's teaching. That crunchy conservatism was greeted at first with such irrational hostility from some quarters of the American right tells us, I think, a great deal about what has happened to American conservatism, and it doesn't tell us anything good. When ideas championed by a man widely regarded as one of the founders, if not the founder, of the modern American conservative movement, cannot get a hearing among his latter-day heirs, and the questions that preoccupied Dr. Kirk don't even seem to engage the imagination of some of our leading conservative polemicists at all. Well, in fact, it's hard to imagine a young Russell Kirk showing up at one of our leading magazines, or at many of our leading magazines on the right today, and even getting a job there. Well, you have to wonder really how useful the label conservative is anymore. But maybe that's a discussion for another day. So, how crunchy was Russell Kirk? Perhaps the better way to phrase that question is, how Kirkian are the Crunchy Cons? We start with two fundamental observations that Crunchy share and which occasion the start of the road to traditionalist conservatism. As Mark Henry has written, the traditionalist conservative's first feeling, the intuition that constitutes his moral source, is the sense of loss, and hence of nostalgia. The conservative spirit, as such, arises only when loss is at hand, or probably more frequently when loss has occurred. Consequently, there is always a reactionary dimension to such conservatism. The conservative typically arrives too late for mere conservation. Now, every Crunchy Con I've spoken to or interviewed articulates in one way or another a sense of cultural loss and shares with other conservatives a lamentation that our society has turned its back on something important about life and how to live it. Mainstream conservatives, as I said, more or less share this point of view, but the traditionalists see, or at least feel, the loss far more deeply, which leads to the second fundamental Crunchy observation, that contemporary conservatism, particularly as it lives in the Republican Party, is unable to effectively address the crisis because it doesn't properly perceive the nature of the crisis. As Dr. Henry notes, Dr. Kirk first articulated his vision of conservatism in part as a reaction to the Chamber of Commerce-style conservatism that had been so thoroughly routed by FDR. I stumbled onto what we at National Review came to call crunchy conservatism when I looked at the fruits of the dominant style of American conservatism, and I began to wonder if what we call conservatism in America today isn't in effect little more than a moralistic, pietistic, and nationalistic gloss on liberalism. In fact, when I wrote my first essay for National Review Online, I got a really interesting email from a conservative, Republican Party activist and a Presbyterian homeschooling mother in Midland, Texas, who wrote to say she and her husband had moved there not long before to plant a church. And she said, I have never lived in a place that's more overtly religious, Christian, or conservative, i.e. Republican in her view, than Midland, Texas. She said, I cannot understand why the conservatism, the purported traditional values of the conservative movement don't seem to matter to people here. Everybody's raising their children according to the same materialistic values that people on the left are doing, except they're mouthing the same words, the same as people on the right always do. She said that there was nothing countercultural about their conservatism at all there, and it really pained her. Or consider the case of Collin County, Texas, the most Republican county by voter registration in the reddest state in the Union. In fact, some people joke that Texas is America's Bavaria. But Collin County is prosperous and religiously active, mega churches all over the place. And yet, the Dallas Morning News did an investigation of Collin County to try to figure out why the personal bankruptcy rate there was so unusually high. Our reporters found out that the divorce rate was going up there as well, and we talked to pastors and priests and rabbis who said that they were looking out in their congregations and seeing good people, religiously observant people, conservative people, whose families were falling apart because they overextended themselves in personal debt, trying to keep up with the Joneses. Robert Hutchins, a fundamentalist Christian livestock farmer I profile in Crunchy Cons, who lives out in rural East Texas, he's a registered Republican, but he told me that he's alienated from his fellow Republicans who live in Collin County because, in his view, they do not fundamentally dissent from the liberal order. Forget their words, forget how they vote, Robert said. Look at how they live. Well, Crunchy Cons do dissent from the liberal order. They ask, what have we lost and how can we get it back? And like Dr. Kirk a half-century ago, they are dissatisfied with the answers provided by mainstream GOP conservatism of our place and time. Now, I've said that I wandered blindly into traditionalism by simply trying to live out my Catholic faith more fully. And by the way, I should say that I'm now a communicant of the Eastern Orthodox Church for painful and complicated reasons not worth getting into here. But as far as crunchiness and traditionalism goes, there is not a dime's worth of difference between the Catholic and Orthodox way of seeing the world. I wouldn't say that theologically, of course, but for our terms here. I grew up a sort of weak tea Protestant and had no serious religion until I converted to Catholicism as an adult. If you try to practice Catholicism or Orthodoxy diligently, you will come to grasp the sacramental principle whether you want to or not. Sacramentalism is the idea that God, or the divine order, manifests itself in the material order. This we can see in the very first and most important of Dr. Kurt's 6 canons of conservatism, belief that a divine intent rules society as well as conscience, he wrote, adding that political problems at bottom are religious and moral problems. Well, living as observant Catholics and learning to think as Catholics, my wife, who is a convert, and I naturally began to make the connections between the sacramentalism, the sacramental vision at the heart of the Catholic faith, and everyday life. Catholic life, serious Catholic life, occasioned for us a great unlearning for both of us as modern Americans, even though we were both Republicans and conservatives. Given our backgrounds, we naturally thought of religion as really not much more than moralism, especially about sexual content. We didn't confront the deeper philosophical implications of Christianity and how its claims should affect aspects of our individual and common lives that we had ignored before. Because we trying to get away from the happy, clappy, modernist Roman Catholic parishes in our neighborhood in Brooklyn, we found ourselves shipwrecked and taken in by the Maronite Catholics in Brooklyn, at a cathedral there, the Lebanese Catholics. They're one of the Eastern rites of the Catholic Church. And it was there that we really saw how incredibly beautiful Catholic worship could be. The Maronites chant the liturgical prayers in Aramaic. And we really got to see the true Catholicity of the church and the value of beauty and tradition and liturgy. And we came in time to value beauty more than we had, and to regard it not as a nice addition to the good life, but as central to the good life. And we began to conform our everyday lives to what the church taught us that reality was. We also came to understand George Nash's point that the most conservative society of all was medieval Christendom, in which all life was sacramentalized and the whole earth was pregnant with the presence of God. We also came to understand the crucial importance of what I call small o Orthodox religion, as opposed to the more liberal, modern interpretations of the faith. We could plainly see that we had far more in common with quote-unquote conservative Protestants, Catholics, Eastern Orthodox, and Jews than we did with liberal members of ours or any other confession. The difference? Those small o Orthodox believers differ on the specifics of truth. We all affirm that there is an objective and knowable truth out there. It is authoritative in that we are duty-bound to conform our lives to it. The modern believer considers religious truth as provisional, as negotiable, given the perceived needs of society. This, the traditionalist must reject. In a political sense, I think this is what Eric Voegelin meant when he said that the real dividing line in modernity is between those who believe that there exists a transcendental spiritual and moral order to which we are bound to conform our lives, and those who believe, put it plainly, that we're at liberty to make it all up as we go along, that the only thing that matters is maintaining the freedom to choose. Conservatives must believe that the material order does rest on a spiritual order. You can call this the natural law. Virtue may be defined as bringing human conduct in conformity with the natural law, in redeeming the fallen world, to use religious language. As Dr. Kirk taught, society must never be thought of as no more than a collection of atomized individuals bound together by a social contract. It is never less than a community of souls. There is a reason, and that is the reason why the only people in my experience who have really understood what I'm trying to get at with crunchy conservatism are people who are religious believers. You cannot separate the religious sense from traditional conservatism. Someone, I forget who, defined modernity as a perversion of the responsibility of stewardship. The religious sense is all about stewardship. The late great Rabbi Abraham Heschel, who was peerlessly eloquent in explaining biblical religion to the layman, said that for men of the Hebrew Bible, material things cannot be understood except as in relation to God. Biblical man was deeply aware of the radical giftedness of creation, which filled him both with a sense of grandeur and of moral responsibility for its use. This wasn't because biblical man thought it would be nice to be grateful to God for this nice world. It was because biblical man was convinced that this was the proper stance in the face of reality. Whenever I think about how some of my critics on the right who dismiss crunchy conservatism as unrealistic, I consider that perhaps they are alienated from metaphysical reality without even knowing it. Anyway, Dr. Kirk, quoting historian Christopher Dawson, wrote, "The recovery of moral control and the return to spiritual order have become the indispensable conditions of human survival, but they could be achieved only by a profound change in the spirit of modern civilization. This does not mean a new religion or a new culture, but a movement of spiritual reintegration, which would restore that vital relation between religion and culture, which has existed at every age and on every level of human development." And that includes, I have to say, food and food culture. To my knowledge, Russell Kirk never discoursed on the metaphysics of chicken cacciatore, more's the pity for us, but the recovery of food folkways and traditions bulldozered by our industrialized mass approach to eating is very much a part of the agrarianism with which Dr. Kirk identified. Joel Salatin, who is the evangelical free-range farmer of my title, I interviewed him for Crunchy Cons, and he said that our factory farming system at every level serves to abstract the larger community from the land. The relentless pursuit of cheap chicken, he said, is costing us plenty. He said to me, and this is a quote from the book, "You know what we're losing? Common sense. There is a wisdom that comes into a culture when many of its people have a direct connection to the land and to life and to the living cycles. I see many of the political agendas today," he said, "as being a total failure to understand life, seasons, accountability, and the connections of life and people to our community. There's just no connection there, so there's no reason, there's no common sense. You can blame as many people on the right as on the left," close quote. Well, this is the essence, I think, of agrarianism, which Dr. Kirk embraced. It is the idea that there is wisdom in being connected closely to the land, even if you aren't a farmer yourself. As Wendell Berry, the Kentucky poet and the foremost agrarian we have today, has put it, agrarianism is a state of mind, a relationship to the land and to the place. It doesn't require actually being a farmer. In fact, I'm the last person you want to have farming anything. But we, living in Dallas as we do, we've developed a relationship to the Hutchinses and the Hales, these fundamentalist Christian farmers who grow the most amazing livestock, and they sell their meat at the farmers market. And we feel like that we are being fully agrarian in supporting them with our friendship, our prayers, and our business, because they're homeschooling their kids, and they're not Catholic, they're fundamentalists. One of them has 12 kids, the other has 8. We think that is a work of God, and we're happy as conservatives and Christians to support their agrarian lifestyle with our money. Agrarianism also implies making a sense of place a central philosophical concern. As we all know, Dr. Kirk lived and worked in his ancestral home in Mecosta. He could have lived most anywhere, but Mecosta was his place. No matter where he traveled and how much he loved other places, he said he was never happier than when he was home at Mecosta planting trees. According to John Henry Newman, Dr. Kirk wrote, Toryism is loyalty to persons. I venture to add that it is also loyalty to places. Developing a strong sense of place is an antidote to the rootlessness and alienation so prevalent in American society today. Learning to love the place where you're from, where your people are from, and making the commitment to stay there is an extremely difficult task, especially given our economy. And this, though, is where architecture and neighborhood planning come in. We have such a disposable attitude towards place today, because I think in part because we don't build houses or places worth caring about. In Crunchy Cons, I praise the simplicity of arts and crafts houses as an ideal worth cherishing. It's the lack of ostentation that I admire and find so congenial to traditional conservatism. The houses we build and the neighborhoods we situate them in can either help or hinder the acquisition of virtue. Dr. Kirk condemned modern architecture and city planning, which he called the architecture of boredom and servility. He warned that the way we build our cities and communities today showed no awareness of the need, the spiritual need, the moral need to keep things on a humane scale and to construct our built neighborhoods to nurture the bonds of community and the common good. The ugliness of our utilitarian approach to architecture, Dr. Kirk quite rightly diagnosed as a sign of spiritual malaise and decadence. I'll give you an example from my book. I interviewed a man who lives in the suburb of Detroit in a house that had belonged to his grandfather. It was a small house, but he and his wife chose to live there, and she is a lawyer by trade, but chose to quit her job to stay at home to raise their children. And they could afford a bigger house somewhere else if they wanted it, but they feel like they'd rather make the sacrifice so they can be fully present for their children, and that includes having to live in a smaller house. They said, besides, we don't need a house bigger than this. His brother, by contrast, also calls himself a conservative, if I remember, chose to build a 3,500 square foot McMansion in a far exurb of Detroit because that's what he could afford, and why not have it? The brother and his wife both have to work long hours to afford this giant house, and they spend a lot of time on the road commuting from their jobs so they can afford the giant house. On the occasion when the whole family happens to be gathered at home at the same time, they don't get together because the kids are off playing in the media room or in their own rooms in this giant castle, and there's no real family life to speak of. Now, in which home are you more likely to find children come out of who are friends of the permanent things? I think it's pretty obvious. And I don't know the McMansion brother, but I would guess that he thought, like many Americans do, that a big house would make him happy. He didn't ask, should I buy this? He just did it because he desired it. That is the consumerist mentality. The idea that the pursuit of material goods and material pleasures are self-justifying ends. Consumerism trains us to indulge our desires and to view life as an array of equally legitimate choices. It can conceive of no higher good than efficiently getting a wider variety of goods to consumers at the lowest possible price. Walmart is its temple. Prosperity, we think, is consumerism's vindication. Now, to be sure, Dr. Kirk, like Crunchy Conservatives, believed in the free market. But as a traditionalist, he saw the market not as an end in itself, but as the means to an end. As Pope John Paul put it, man was not made for the market was made for man. A very Kirkian notion, that. Dr. Kirk believed that a free economy was the most just economy, and the freest economy is one in which artisans, small farmers, and small merchants are the norm. Leviathan business is just as dangerous as Leviathan government. Because man is fallen, original sin, care must be taken not to allow business to grow too powerful. As Dr. Kirk wrote, the slave labor camps of the communist Chinese are economically efficient after a fashion, but only because they take no reckoning of human lives or moral principles. Thus our American economy, though good in itself, is important not merely for its own sake. Its real importance is the contribution it makes to our justice and order and freedom, our ability to live in dignity as truly human persons. One can easily imagine how Dr. Kirk would view our current regime of illegal migrant labor, which invites contempt for the law, the ruin of communities, and the exploitation of poor and vulnerable foreigners, all to keep cheap chicken and the like on the American consumer's table. Now, educational reform, as most of us know, was a passion of Dr. Kirk's. He bird-dogged the educational establishment for his entire career. He was a tireless opponent of the factory approach to education that has become standard in American life. To Dr. Kirk and to the traditionalist, education is first and foremost character education, precisely the thing that we have exiled from our public schools. He denounced the four sins of contemporary public education: equalitarianism, technicalism, progressivism, and egotism. As Dr. Kirk wrote, education properly understood is dedicated to the proposition that the end of education is the elevation of the reason of the human person for the human person's own sake, to the proposition that the higher imagination is better than the sensate triumph, to the proposition that the fear of God and not the mastery over man and nature is the object of learning, to the proposition that quality is worth more than quantity, to the proposition that justice takes precedence over power, to the proposition that order is more lovable than egoism, and so forth. Just this week, I was talking to the liberal scholar and controversialist Camille Paglia about the state of the humanities. That voluble atheist told me how appalled she was by how little her college students at the University of the Arts in Philadelphia today know about the Bible. She said that we are in serious danger of losing our patrimony from educational ignorance. I asked her what the reform should be. She said, quote, people have to educate themselves. Well, we talked about the homeschooling movement and how it was dedicated to an older traditional view of education, of how education for character is the primary goal of most homeschoolers. Well, she highly approved of that when I told her, said, I don't know if you've heard of Russell Kirk. She hadn't, but this is what he thought about education. And she said, that's amazing. That's exactly right. Now, when Camille Paglia, the self-described feminist, bisexual atheist, thinks Russell Kirk is right on about something, you know, it's time for some cross-fertilization there, at least some crosstalk. Anyway, I write in Crunchy Cons about how homeschooling is the ideal traditionalist way to educate your child and to defy the leveling and the liberalism and relativism that suffuse the state schools. Homeschoolers have long been profoundly countercultural, and I think it would have delighted Dr. Kirk had he lived to see them moving toward mainstream acceptability. For one simple reason: homeschooling works, and it works because it conforms to the human nature and the dignity of the human mind and the human spirit. Now, before I end, I have to say a word about environmentalism. I consider it a real tragedy that so many of us on the right have become so contemptuous of the environmental movement that we've allowed the left to completely own this as a political issue. Dr. Kirk said there is nothing more conservative than conservation of the natural world. But in our time, the only contribution that most on the right have to make to the great public debate over the environment is withering, reactionary contempt for environmentalists. This is somewhat understandable because much of the contemporary environmentalism is, in fact, hysterical and ridiculous. But mere mockery is an abdication of the moral responsibility we conservatives have to be good stewards of our God-given world. What we on the right can bring to the discussion is a sense of prudence and of balance. Wendell Berry is known for excoriating industry for its rape of the land in his native country, Kentucky. But he told me that he refuses to lend his voice to the campaigns of environmental groups because they consider mankind to be a blight on the natural world. They don't understand, Berry told me, that man is part of the natural order, that man has legitimate needs that should be accommodated. This, I think, is where conservatives could help. But Wendell Berry finds few, if any, allies on the right, who are all busy making fun of anyone who challenges industrialism. This is a tragedy, not only for conservatism, but for the common good. Now, I've been talking about applying traditionalist conservative worldview toward the right ordering of our relationship to the world as it is, and my book is full of stories like this. But I think the most delightful aspect of Crunchy Conservatism, and perhaps its most distinctly Kirkian, is its celebration of what the sage of Macosta meant when he described himself as a Bohemian Tory. It is true that traditionalist conservatism is in most respects a lament for what has been lost, but properly understood, it is also a cheerful celebration of what has been saved. It is an affirmation that, in Dr. Kirk's words, the world remains sunlit despite its vices. We've heard George Nash describe Dr. Kirk as a romantic traditionalist by instinct. This is true. The phrase Birkenstock Burkeans, which I coined to describe Crunchy Cons, is a rather less poetic way to say Bohemian Tories. Here is Dr. Kirk from his Confessions of a Bohemian Tory. A Tory, according to Samuel Johnson, is a man attached to orthodoxy in church and state. A Bohemian is a wandering and often impecunious man of letters or arts, indifferent to the demands of bourgeois fad and foible. Such a one has your servant been. Tory and Bohemian go not ill together. It is quite possible to abide by the norms of civilized existence, what Mr. T.S. Eliot calls the permanent things, and yet to set at defiance the soft securities and sham conventionalities of 20th century sociability, close quote. Now, we hear there the voice of the true humanist, to whom nothing authentically human is alien. I think my favorite line in all of Kirk was his claim that I would have given any number of classical pediments for one poor battered gargoyle. Russell Kirk wanted to re-enchant the world. He saw in the mystery and variety of human existence and human traditions liberation of the moral imagination. He also saw ghosts, and so have I. As a South Louisiana boy, I speak from personal experience that little more will do to shake one out of one's confining rationality than confronting actual ghosts. If you have the good fortune to visit Piety Hill and to warm yourself by the Kirk's family's hearth, unless you are an insensate clod, you will take in through your senses the full measure of the great man's Bohemian Tory mind and heart and sensibility. As Annette Kirk has written, Russell's emphasis on things of the heart and the hearth became more evident after we were married and began to have daughters. So mindful was he of pleasing children that when building an addition onto his ancestral home, he instructed the carpenters to place the windows closer to the floor so little ones could look out more easily. He also made sure there was a room in a tower that could be used as a clubhouse and a winding staircase to a cupola set atop the house, allowing them to view village fireworks on the 4th of July. Isn't that marvelous? Russell Kirk defied the stereotype of the conservative as a pinch-mouthed, tight-lipped scold. Here was a man in love with life. A man who only delights in the material world is a hedonist. A man who does not delight in it at all is a specter. Only a man who delights in the material world while standing in right relation to its goodness can be called a man in full. And Russell Kirk was a man in full. So what do we do with all this? Traditional conservatism, Crunchy Conservatism, it's not a political program, but rather a sensibility, a rich and fruitful way of looking at the world. It is one that will necessarily have political implications. But if you go to traditionalist sources seeking precise opinions about this or that public policy question, as Dr. Nash said, you will likely be disappointed. As David Frum wrote, Dr. Kirk's vision offers not a political program, but a vivid and poetic image of how society might better itself. The traditionalist approach to political questions in a given time and place seems to me would be to ask which course of action here will serve the end of helping man to live virtuously in community. It sounds very abstract, and it is, but if you reason from this principle, you will often arrive at a sensible conclusion, and it will not always be the conclusion reached by the Republican Party. I strongly agree with Dr. Kirk's insight that the institution most important to conserve is the family. A free market globalized economic system that leaves ordinary families with little choice but for both parents to work to provide the basics for their children is or should be a problem for traditionalist conservatives. Last fall, on my way to a conference in Macosta, I read in the New York Times a striking story about despair in a village in Provence, in France. The story told about how the agricultural economy of the village, Chateau Renard, had virtually collapsed. They used to grow tomatoes in that village and can them in that village. Then a Chinese concern bought the local canning plant and, given the economy of scale, found it cheaper to ship Chinese-grown tomatoes to Provence to be canned there. The Provençal fields around that village are in ruins now. Here's what the mayor of the town told the Times. Quote, "Our farms are becoming monuments of the dead. Our town is a bedroom community that services others. We are losing our confidence that life will somehow get better, losing our roots, our rural identity." It will not surprise you to learn that the National Front is moving in to take advantage of this spiritual vacuum and the confusion in this hard-hit farming town. I submit to you that the mainstream Republican response to this sort of thing is more often than not just a shrug. Too bad for the French tomato farmers, but hey, that's the free market. That's creative destruction. I submit to you also that traditionalist conservatives must stand with the farmers, not the international capitalist. I submit to you that the fate of French tomatoes has everything to do with the fate of Western civilization in the end. Our challenge is to find ways to live meaningfully and authentically human life in a mass consumer society where it's harder than ever to hold on to tradition. It should never be enough, never enough for a conservative anyway, to make one's peace with modernity when modernity strips individual and community life of so much of what it means to be fully human. It is a form of nihilism, in fact, to give in to the idea that none of this stuff about food and neighborhood design and farmers really matters, and only matters to conservative aesthetes, or these sort of boutique nostalgists who are fussy and who are fooling themselves about tradition. The conservative columnist Maggie Gallagher wrote a piece critical of my book, and in it she noted what she calls the pathos of traditionalists in modern America. The only kind of traditionalism they can have, she wrote, is the kind that they cobble together. I credit her point, but then she goes too far when she writes, "Is there room in the great conservative table for people who love God, family, arts and crafts, architecture, ancient liturgy, Birkenstocks, and organic chickens? Sure, Rod, I'll dine with you anytime. But is this really a very important question? About shoes? No, and I never claimed that it was. But the quality of our thoughts about and relationship to God, family, architecture, literature, food, these are not only very important questions, but among the most important questions. It is a failure of the moral imagination to think otherwise. If we don't confront these questions, however difficult our time and place make it, what chance do we have at recovery, at finding a place to take one's stand? Granted, shoring up fragments against the ruin is an imperfect response to the catastrophe of modernity, but what choice do we have? Those who laugh at what we're doing, strike me as kind of like the people who made fun of Noah for building that crazy boat of his. Well, what then are we to do? Last year, I found myself in Dallas listening to a panel discussion among conservatives who are considering prospects for conservatives and conservatism. Phyllis Schlafly was on that panel, and she was banging away about the wickedness of the public schools and the judiciary. I found myself completely agreeing with everything she said, but I was still dispirited by her remarks. They sounded like they were about 30 years old and inadequate to the crisis of culture and indeed of civilization that we now face. I was much more encouraged by what Tom Hibbs, the Thomist philosopher who heads the Baylor University Honors College, had to say. Tom remarked that we conservatives have been so preoccupied with politics that we have neglected the long, patient, diligent work of building up local institutions, including the family, through which we can preserve virtue and pass on an active love of the permanent things to future generations. And I was reminded of something my friend Caleb Stiegel, a young lawyer in Kansas, prairie populist, who's writing a book for ISI, by the way, what he said on National Review's Crunchy Con blog. It does no good to vote an anti-abortion ticket if in one's life and community there is no drive and discipline towards holiness. This is what Dr. Kirk was getting at, I think, when he wrote that the urgent need of the United States of America near the end of the 20th century is for a virtue arising from habit and affection rather than from ideological preaching. I don't advocate political quietism, but I do advocate rededication to rediscovering and embracing the habits and affections necessary to a life of traditional virtue, of holiness, if you like. I do advocate active participation in the little platoons in our own neighborhoods. I do advocate renewing the moral imagination of the young so that they, and so that we all, can conceive of how we might redeem the time that we've been given. Caleb Stiegel has written, "One does not need to theorize how to view and engage secular modernity if one daily concentrates on self-sacrifice, prayer, and simply doing the work of God and disciplining the body and mind to order themselves according to their place and their heritage." That is the essence of traditional conservatism. That is what I consider the essence of crunchy conservatism. Our challenge is to work together to brighten our own corner of the world. I don't know that the present order can be saved, but I believe we have to consider ourselves like Benedict of Nursia, Saint Benedict, who didn't despair of the collapse of Roman civilization in the West around him. He responded to it creatively by forming communities of holiness, monasteries, within which it was possible to live a life of faith and virtue in community amid the chaos and the disorder of the Dark Ages. In some sense, we have to all find ways to be Benedictines now. Anyway, you never know how Providence might use us. Another holy monk, St. Seraphim of Sarov in the Eastern Church, said, "Acquire the Holy Spirit, and thousands around you will be saved." Now, in a more secular sense, he was praising the redemptive power of example. We are not responsible for saving the world. We are only responsible for doing the right thing. If we do so with confidence and joy, intending that inner light, the world may in time come to see what we see and join us. But we are duty-bound to try, no matter what. And in any case, if we were to succeed, we traditionalists would be nothing more but beggars showing other beggars where the food is. I close with this passage from Dr. Kirk's autobiography, an excerpt of which I read last night at bedtime in The Essential Russell Kirk, which I kindly left on my pillow instead of a mint. The author, Dr. Kirk, writes in the third person, "This present life here below," Kirk had perceived often in his mind's eye, "is an ephemeral existence, precarious as in an arena rather than upon a stage. Some men are meant to be gladiators or knights errant, not mere strolling players. Swords drawn, they stand on a darkling plain against all comers and all odds. How well they bear themselves in the mortal struggle will determine in what condition they shall put on incorruption." His sins of omission and commission notwithstanding, Kirk had blown his horn and drawn his sword of imagination in the arena of the blighted 20th century that he might assail the follies of the time. Russell Kirk was a wise man and a happy warrior. Whether they call themselves Crunchy Cons or Bohemian Tories, may our tribe increase. Thank you very much.